Policy Forum series on sustainable food and agriculture. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you today, with those who are joined us live and also online. So this is a very interesting topic for us, for many of us, dealing with trade and agriculture-related issues. So we have a nice number of panelists today with us, online or live. So we have 1.5 hours to talk and discuss about several issues related to agri-food trade and sustainability. And as we discussed with Mark Roper, I would probably give him the floor to set the scene a bit, and then we can start discussions. So,
okay, thanks. Straight in. Yeah, a very interesting topic. So I'm also glad to be back here. I came here some years ago. There was a colleague, Lisanne Grove, did her PhD on CCP COP negotiations. Is this the European government? I work as I work in DG Agri. My main job is to go to the OECD as a representative on the Committee on Agriculture. And this particular topic, sustainable ag trade, is on the agenda. And one of the sort of byproducts of having the job I have is that I find I have to explain to people across the table, like, basically how the EU works. You know, they don't always understand that. And in this particular topic, it's been a struggle. You mentioned just before, Attila, it's complicated, complex. It's somehow complex. It's a three-way Rubik's cube. So I had reason the other day to think, well, in the hotel, how am I going to explain this to? And in trying to explain it, I explained a lot to myself, and my colleagues started to say, well, yeah, that was quite handy. So I'd like to share that with you as by way of a sort of scene setter, because part of the problem we have, let's say, communicating outside Europe about our interest in sustainable ag trade is people say, where did you get this from? And it may be a sort of convenience. I know you guys know this in your DNA, but Europe has a history which actually has a point where you can sort of say, well, it started then, and then it's been very well documented, should we say. If you ask other polities about your history, I mean, they don't really know where to start. So with the EU, you start in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome. I don't want to get too, shall we say, too treaty-like on this, but I think the treaties sort of reveal something. I just want to point to you some of the key steps. I've worked in agriculture all my career. Now, one of the features about the treaty with regard to agriculture is the objectives have not changed. So in the beginning, they were things like standard of living and productivity. Okay, for agriculture, and they haven't changed over the years. Now, the other three objectives in the treaty are, however, overlap with trade and markets. They were stabilize markets. They were ensure supplies. Anybody remember the last one?
Food security.
Fair prices for consumers. And that's why the policy, when it started, was somehow a market policy. Okay. Now, if you read the history of these three policy areas, the single market, the common commercial policy, and environment, the following appears. That in the beginning, in 1957, this was also written down. That's what we'll do. And it was about removing barriers. And this existed as an objective to say, well, we need to get to a common tariff. Okay. And does anybody know in 1957 what the status of environment was? Okay. So then, time moves on. Well, then what happened next? Well, what happened next was, because there's a bit of a delay, this happened. It was fully fledged. I didn't fully realize till I started reading, I'm an old guy, but this is old stuff. That apparently, took us ages to get rid of the internal barriers. And still some of the member states, there was still not a common policy because still some member states were applying tariffs on a national basis to people they liked or didn't like. So in fact, the last one went in the 90s. So we tell ourselves as Europeans, we did it all here, but in actual fact, it didn't happen overnight. But once you have a single market, you can actually talk more coherently about your common commercial policy. So it came of age. And environment, who knows what happened in the Single European Act? I didn't know this, but it was slipped in. That the EU will take action. Hence the origin of the action, presumably the Environment Action Plans, programs. Still not a policy yet. That had to come later in the 90s. You start getting sustainability, I forget, Amsterdam, there are a whole range of them. Some of them contain, and I've got it on a PowerPoint, so don't worry, I'll send it to you after. Sustainability starts to come in. Interestingly here, so meanwhile agriculture is not changing. Okay, it's still fitting in with all these other policies. Nothing happened until around Maastricht-Nice with trade policy. So what were the big shift in trade policy in the early 90s? So we had free movement of goods and services inside the internal market. We had now a common policy with goods, but we hadn't yet put in intellectual property, services, and investment. This was when all the TTIP type things came, which scared the European public and scared the member states. The Commission can't have these competence in these areas. But in fact, having read, and I could show you the references, the Commission had been gaining these competences through the courts. So it was really just sort of like rubber sealing what de facto was the case, even though, of course, that still causes a lot. Now then, you're all modern people, Lisbon, and you're interested in international. So what are the key features of Lisbon for agriculture? No change. For the single market, keep going. For the commercial policy, what was the little phrase added in the Lisbon Treaty? Something like it will be developed at the service of EU international objectives. So it was serve the EU. And what happened here, and this is the biggest surprise of all, which I've seen, why are DG Environment colleagues so motivated by global concerns? Do you know what's in the Treaty of Lisbon? Nobody? Well, there you go. Read the PowerPoint, because they introduced in the Treaty of Lisbon that the EU will solve global environmental problems, in particular climate change.
Which paragraph?
You'll see.
Okay.
There are three very nice academic papers.
Mhm.
So there I will sit down, because for me this sets a scene. I'm amongst sort of like, as it were, Europeans. I think it might be useful, even mine after 30 years of the game, when talking about these things, to refer to things which this explains why there is ambition. This somehow explains why agriculture is a little bit like we're not quite with all these treaty changes, because they were happening elsewhere, as it were. It's intrigued me for some years working on agricultural trade, why we don't do more about agricultural trade services. But okay, they're in the service. It's always subsumed. It's always environment driving and trade driving. as it were. But now, and let's get into it, this project and this topic brings all three together. Three-way is a sufficiently complex policy set of interaction. So those are my opening remarks, which for me, this one really caught me by surprise. And this, I realized, just in terms of trade, you see, you've got to ask yourself the question, I mean, you know, I didn't mention to you the history of the agriculture, but okay, they're just details on this. 94 agreement on agriculture. Could it have happened had there not been a common EU market? Probably not. You've got to ask yourself in 94, how did that happen? Well, it happened I always knew the internal reasons. Let's say, yeah, it was costing too much and all this. Yeah? But the external reason is, well, because the single market, which interacts with the external market, had come of age. And so the EU could, with its gaining competence, actually negotiate that. But now we're in the question really is, well, here we are, WTO, what are you doing? What can you do about this? I know they're asking themselves the question, it's always the question, always comes back to, what does the agreement on agriculture, where's it going to deal with this, which is now, we've got it all written high up on our to-do list as Europeans. All three areas are there. Pass it down.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for this introductory words and setting the scene. I would also like to ask Nelly Haidu to introduce herself a bit and talk about how she sees how coherent and how sustainable agri-food trade policies are in the EU. Any thoughts on any issues on this?
Thanks, first of all, for this ride through history. I have to say, I did study European integration, but never from this angle, so I'll take that with me. Maybe just a few words about whom we are representing. So CELCA has a terrible name, but it's the European Legion Committee for Agriculture and Agri-Food Trade. And we represent the most essential agri-food commodities in their trade. So from meat to dairy to grain and oilseed trades, the ag sector, but also more import-driven sectors such as tea and herbal infusions and so on. As such, we represent around about 35,000 European traders, and we are also part of the strategic dialogue on the future of agriculture, which was recently called in by Ursula von der Leyen, and we are active part of drafting these recommendations. So I'm very grateful for Mark's recap, because that will give me some ammunition as well on the environmental part to frame some discussions, which you can imagine are very heated at the moment. So CELCA is a pro-trade advocacy organization. So we believe in the benefit of import and export. And our vision in that regard is to achieve open and sustainable and fair agri-food trade. I'm going to come to that, how to achieve that. One of the main elements, what we see very substantial, is to strengthen agri-food trade as an essential pillar of sustainable food systems. As we can see that there has been a lot of criticisms around agriculture trade, free trade agreements, but also within the European Union, there is a lack of recognition what the role of agri-food trade is in the single market. So that's why it was very interesting what Mr. Cropper was saying here. So what we did, normally we did a very traditional approach. So we would look at market access issues, we would look at free trade agreements and how to support our members and market access. A year ago, I was asking my members, what are you actually doing on sustainable agri-food trade? So we had a bit of a kickoff session to see, okay, so CELCA is an umbrella of umbrella associations. So I was asking all my different commodity members, what are you actually doing? And we found that most of the members were actually not working on trade policies affecting sustainability, but they would rather work on consumer and on producer policies. So the first question we asked ourselves, why is that? First of all, I think the key recognition was that when we look at the Green Deal, the most elements everybody was covering were farm to fork, but there was actually no two in the farm to fork. So there were either policies affecting producers or affecting consumers. And the second element was that we saw a paradigm shift of how trade, how policies are affecting agri-food trade. Meaning, so we saw that it was less attractive and less discussed when we look at classic trade policy topics such as SPS, tariffs, free trade negotiations, which eventually have been substantially blocked by the sustainability debate. And on the other hand, we saw that a completely new set of policies affecting agri-food trade were entering the scenes, which at least the advocacy and interest representation environment was not prepared for, such as EU deforestation regulation, the corporate sustainability reporting directive, the due diligence directive, forced labor. All these policies were made by DGs we normally would not think are those shaping our policies. And this is already my first, hint on coherence. So what we've been seeing from that is that there have been policies which were affecting us, but without our consultation. And this is why, for example, EU deforestation at the moment at implementation level is so problematic, because DG Environment, for example, was operating in a big silo and not really operating with the stakeholders. So this is something we found in this first approach. So what we decided was, okay, let's go into a deep dive how to achieve sustainable agri-food trade. And we wanted to be accountable. So we said, okay, we can no longer have this discussion either being against environmental policies. We need to be accountable what we ask for, but we need to be very clear as well also about our role in this sustainability debate. So what we did is we met with researchers, we met with the FAO, we were at WTO, so I have also a few comments on that later. And the outcome was a set of recommendations. I'm going to dive into that. But the key recognition was, okay, and this was, I think, the eye-opener and also guiding us now into our interest representation and advocacy efforts is the FAO State of Commodity Markets report of 2022 found or described that we're experiencing a shift, a geographical shift of agricultural production inside Europe, but also outside Europe. So we will experience crop migration. We will experience that countries in the south will no longer be able to produce. There are unused potentials. Probably Central Eastern Europe will be much more important in agri-food production, and in the second stage also on trade. So we saw two major elements. We see that agri-food trade is essential to mitigate the effects of climate change in a way, because we're going to be the one transporting the goods from A to B where it's no longer possible. But on the other hand, we also need to do some further contingency planning to transition, because obviously we have a set of unsustainable operations starting from emissions, our impact on water, and so on. So what I can say for the moment is a set of challenges we see is what is very, very difficult, and also when we now have the discussions in the dialogue on the future of agriculture, is that we have no real definition of sustainability, which is eventually not helping to shape the objectives also for ourselves, to define what kind of concrete steps we can suggest. We see, and I feel you here, Mark, on that, there is a disconnect between the multilateral, the EU and the stakeholder debate. So we see that there is not enough policy space given at the moment to environmental and trade challenges, including the WTO. We see coming from this whole environmental regulatory evolution, a growing fragmentation and missing harmonization. And we see a re-emergence, or probably not a re-emergence, but a reinforcement of this discussion on diverging standards, or what you may know as mirror clause, which is a very difficult subject, and where we're really trying to re-navigate the debate to the technical discussion and away from using actually that word. So I'm finishing here very quickly. So we have a set of recommendations, but this is just the start. So we have been identifying a set of enablers, amongst them, obviously, market access, because it's substantial for resilience. Strengthening circularity. I think there's a huge potential of using agri-food trade as an essential part to create a circular agri-food trade. Digitalization, a very unpopular topic amongst agri-food traders, because nobody wants to have the transparency, but I think transparency would create efficiency. So this is something where we need to see how we can use this. Climate smart and climate resilient infrastructure is something completely underestimated. If we have rising sea levels, ports, railways, and so on, roads, etc. And we also need to think differently about food and nutrition security. So this is the one set. Then there's a whole set on international level. I keep it really short, what we could do at multilateral level. But first and foremost, one of the key recognitions was we need more policy coherence and more coordination between the different DGs, and we need contingency planning, because if we don't understand how our agri-food production will change, we will not be able to do this right structural investment. So this is what we are very strongly advocating for. And there I see also that you can combine sustainability and environmental elements with trade policy. And this is just the preliminary stage, so we will continue to work on that in more depth. Also with a stronger focus on water and trade and biodiversity and trade.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Nali. You have also shared some of your thoughts on future issues. I think we will get back to these later. Okay, I would also ask now our online panelists, starting with Virginia, to introduce yourself, please, and please share a few words about the work on fair trade advocacy and how you see this sustainable agri-food trade from your perspective.
Thank you, Attila. Thank you for the invitation as well. I hope you can hear me well, but I think yes. So I'm Virginia Ensley, International Institutional Relations Manager at the Fair Trade Advocacy Office. The Fair Trade Advocacy Office is an actor within the global fair trade movement. And this means that we, as a fair trade movement, we speak of trade and social justice. We have the aim of improving the livelihoods of smallholder farmers and producers in the global south that are generally in more vulnerable positions in terms of global trade structures, this for historical reasons. The vision of the Fair Trade Advocacy Office, or FTAO, if you hear me say that, it's a world in which justice and sustainable development are at the heart of the trade structures and at the heart of trading and purchasing practices, so that everybody through their work can maintain a decent and a dignified livelihood and develop their full human potential, which when we think about agriculture is not the scene that we are seeing. So as I mentioned, we sort of represent smallholder farmers and workers. Just for general information, by the data shared by FAO, smallholder farmers account to 1/3 of global agricultural production. So we're speaking about big numbers of farmers. But the issue is that even though they may be numerous, they are not working as a large group together. This is also for historical reasons, by the different ways that they are building up and working. When you look at the different producer networks, they are fairly smaller than when you look at bigger agribusinesses. So that's why we see how 1/3 of the farmers that are doing our global agricultural production are in a position where they are not having a decent livelihood by the production that they're doing. And that has been a key issue that we're trying to address through our work, which is looking at EU policies and how EU policies could improve the situation of farmers and agricultural producers in the global south. So when it comes to the issue of sustainable agriculture and the nexus between trade and agriculture, we see how these two are not working hand in hand. That trade structures are not benefiting sustainable agriculture. They are not enabling it to the extent that we really need it. Also, that trade policies are not much promoting sustainable agriculture and are not contributing to food security outside of the EU, because what we are seeing a lot is that the farmers in and outside the EU, because we saw that with the protest in Brussels in the past months, is that farmers now are at a situation of poverty. They are not making profit by the production that they make. And that is intrinsically wrong. And we can get there later into the share of how the profit is disseminated within different commodities, but it's not the farmer who is making a decent living out of this. And that is very worrisome. And what we see there is that trade structures are not helping to solve the situation, rather they are blocking a positive change. And one of the biggest problems that we see is the disconnection between trade and agriculture, in the sense that trade is not working towards the goal of agricultural policy that Mr. Corper set out at the beginning. So we had standards of living as a priority and productivity, but we have seen how in terms of standards of living, not much has changed. Farmers at EU level, but especially outside of the EU, are not making a decent living out of their agricultural production. And that's certainly a problem. And as I said, trade policies, trade structures are not contributing to solving this issue. Something that we have seen very clear in the past years working on agricultural policy is how there is a lack of trade and external dimension in agricultural policies, which when you're trying to create policies that want to achieve sustainable food systems, you will get only as far if you are not taking into account the trade aspects and the external aspects. Because something that we also see as a problem is that when it comes to agricultural policies, there is a very EU approach, which is leaving aside the fact that the EU will never be fully self-sufficient. There will always be commodities that are very key for the EU consumers that will not be possible to grow in the EU. Let's say cocoa, coffee, bananas, just to name key commodities. And if you're designing sustainable agricultural policies or sustainable food system policies that are not looking at the external dimension, then you are leaving aside key commodities. And there we see a big disconnection. One last point that I want to highlight for now is there is a lack of, on the other hand, a sustainable agriculture approach in trade policies. So we also work a lot in looking at the trade agreements, and particularly free trade agreements, and we see how those are not promoting sustainable agriculture, but rather perpetuating our situation in where it's let's open the market as much as possible, with disregarding whether that is bringing us closer to our more internal sustainable agriculture policies.
Okay, thank you very much, Virginia, for these introductory thoughts. And now we have two academics with us in the panel, Jyrki and Ralph. So can I ask you, Jyrki, first to introduce yourself and also share your thoughts on this issue, please?
Yes, thank you, Attila, and good Wednesday afternoon to everybody. And thank you for the invitation for this event. So my name is Jyrki Niemi. I'm a research professor at the Natural Resources Institute Finland, and I have over 30 years of experience in the analysis of agriculture policies and agriculture trade policies. And this kind of empirical analysis of the agri-food supply chain has played quite a central role in my research. And throughout my research career, I have closely followed the trade policies related to agri-food products. And I have been also trying to analyze the effects of policy decision on the international trade of agri-food products. I have also followed with particular interest the dynamics of trade policy negotiation in the World Trade Organization, WTO, and of course, in the past, my research work in trade policy has focused specifically on the effects of trade barriers such as tariffs and import fees and domestic support policies on the trade flows between countries. Now the sustainability issues are increasingly a part of the trade policy discourse, and the question, what is the role that trade plays in improving sustainability? And it has become an urgent issue internationally, and the urgency is, of course, underscored by the climate change and biodiversity loss, and also the lack of a kind of a clear multilateral trade policy framework. So policymakers and key stakeholders still have to agree the ways to achieve this goal, that how to align them with the sustainability objectives. Improving sustainability throughout trade policy is, of course, needed, but it is, of course, also quite challenging. And it is also evident from the literature that trade has very different impact on different sustainable development goals, and there are many trade-offs between the different SDGs. So while agriculture can play a positive tool for sustainability, there are divergent perspectives on the role that the trade plays in improving sustainability. I think increasingly there is at least recognition that sustainability should be adapted to local context in agri-food system, that we cannot approach that with one size fits all mindset. Every region has a unique production practices and soils and cultures and landscape and so on. So there is this fragmentation. But yes, trade in agri-food products is important, and of course, current international trade of agri-food products helps to improve food security in the world, which is very important. And improving the sustainability, that requires somehow holistic approach. It also requires international cooperation and commitment, how to balance the economic growth with environmental protection. I think I stop here now and continue then when we discuss more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jyrki. And all of us are actually here from the EU, but it would be also interesting to see how other countries see EU trade policies. So I would ask now Ralph to step in and introduce yourself a bit, and also share your initial thoughts on this issue, please.
All right, thank you very much. I suppose you can hear me clearly?
Yes.
Good, all right. Yes, my name is Ralph Ama. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research at the University of Ghana. My background is agricultural economics, and it's something that I enjoy doing, just looking at development topics, development economics topics that lie especially with smallholder farmers, developing issues, topics that have to do with livelihoods, food security, food safety, and also running some field experiments when it comes to food security, etc. The institute that I represent has as its mission to carry out activities that will promote socio-economic development of Ghana in particular, and then Africa as a whole. Specifically, some of the things that we do have immediate bearing on the problems that the problems that border on development needs in Ghana, and in many we've had opportunity of doing same in other African countries. We try to relate assignments to the government, so we try to do policy relevant, evidence-based research that can, change, if I should put it that way. So we, in addition to that, try also to serve as an institute that monitors and frequently evaluates the effects of development policies, projects, programs, both in terms of their objectives and then the general consequences of those. So that's basically what I do at my institute. Broadly on the subject of trade and sustainability, or trade and sustainable development. Trade. Let me start with let me follow up with the history that the speakers gave us regarding the EU. And I think it started from 1957 or so. Yeah, Good. Okay, so in terms, I'm going to speak in context and the context of Ghana and then the environmental agreements that we've had with the EU. And you will know that starting from the 70s and then the 80s, we had the Lomé Agreement or the Lomé Partnership, and we then went into the Cotonou Agreement. The Lomé Agreement was in Togo. Partnership was in Benin, and that was in, I think, 2000 or so. And then we came to 2003, where we had the negotiations with the EU and then the West African bloc of countries, ECOWAS, and some other African countries, I think also they have had their agreements either negotiated or signed around that time. But in 2007, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire decided to initiate an agreement which they I think there was conclusion of the negotiations that have to do with the regional IEPA. In 2016, signed and ratified the IEPA. And then the first meeting of a joint EPA committee with Ghana took place in 2018, only for Ghana to actually running whatever provisions there were in the IPA, and I think 2021. Ghana the opportunity to actually have and quota-free access to the EU market, which is one of the biggest markets for Ghana. I think the other two are, the top three, I think, are China, India, and the EU. So in return, the EU would have, I think, 80% or so access to the Ghana market. This is really interesting, especially for the fact that products to the EU, and so definitely it is going to and the productivity or production related issues that confront smallholder farmers. So this is very important when it comes to that, and our research usually would look into the benefits of these, how livelihoods have changed, and whether or not even the issue about sustainability in itself is having a bearing. In their lives. Let me just mention that with the EPA, it's a very faint definition or explanation of what the term sustainability development actually means. And I think the lady who spoke earlier mentioned what we would say sustainability is and sustainable development is. It is only mentioned, I think, in the preamble of the IEPA, what sustainable development is. And we do not see any trade and sustainability chapter, trade and sustainable development chapter in the IEPA or in the EPA. And this calls for intense debate, and many people have either accepted or opposed the EPA in general. Some critics have said that the EPA was unable to provide any economic security anytime that prices will plummet, for example. Some have said that there is no incentives for better governance, and it discriminates against non-ACP countries, etc. And so I would end here with a thought that there are questions about why there is no trade and sustainable development chapter in the EPA, for example, and why the critics of the EPA have heightened, if I should use that term. So while we go into the discussion, probably we'll be able to delve deeper and talk more specifically about the EU-Ghana EPA. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ralph, and thank you everyone for this first round. So now it seems that we all want to shape EU policies to be towards a more sustainable future, right? So there are many issues on the table. Many of those have already been mentioned: deforestation standards, child labor, forced labor, fair trade, many different issues. So my next question to the panelists would be like, if you were in a position to decide what to choose from, where to go in the EU as a next step towards a more sustainable development agenda, what would you choose and on what basis you would choose out of these issues? So it's extremely complicated, I know, but after a while we need to say something. Can I ask any of you who would like to step in and tell your thoughts on this?
You're asking a heavy question.
I know, that is my role.
Yeah, I give it a try. I think we need to have two major discussions. I think we need to really know and have a discussion about the objective of our food systems. So what should our food system serve for? And I think Virginia raised an interesting point. She said, yeah, the EU trade policy is actually not looking so much at the external dimension. The interesting part is that even amongst all the stakeholders, there's a big division on what the food systems should serve for. So there's a big group also amongst NGOs, but also business organizations, farmers, says actually EU food policy and EU food production should simply serve for ourselves, which is a bit, I would say, from my perspective, short-sighted, because food systems are interconnected, they are global, they are fragmented, we are interdependent, and it's, I would say, unrealistic to achieve. But I think we need to find a response, because that will help us, obviously, to shape food systems. If we know if we're focusing on feeding the world, are we focusing on feeding ourselves? I'm saying it very bluntly. And I think the second element is, sorry that I didn't cover so much the social component, but I think from our perspective, I think the major structural changes are coming from environmental changes. We need to prepare. That would be my first step. We need to understand, will it be the Central Eastern European countries, which will be the major food producers? If that is so, what kind of structural changes do we need to foster there? What kind of investments do we need to foster? And this also includes, obviously, farmers and raising their incomes. But I mean, that is a completely complex debate, which would go too far here. So I would say we need to start from there, and that also includes the international component, because we are not operating in a silo. So if we look on the FAO report on changing geographies, we will see that the sub-Saharan area at some point will not be able to produce food anymore. So we will have a set of social issues inside Europe with declining production regions in the south, but also with external factors, which we have to factor in. And I think there is a big fear to structurally look into that and to address it, because it seems very big, but if we don't do it, we will also not find the answer.
Okay, thank you. Great. Any other thoughts from any of the panelists on this? You may also react to each other's comments if you would like to.
I can jump in if you want me. Oh,
sure.
Yeah, so to reply to your question, I would add a concept, yet another concept to our conversation, but I think that it's relevant, and for us it's sort of part of the solution, and it's to reinforce policy coherence for development. So as we did a little recap, history recap, this is also a key component that came up with the Maastricht Treaty and reinforced in the Lisbon Treaty. And so far for us, what we're seeing with the introduction of the Global Green Deal and the policies associated with it is that it has been a bit lost in the way. And it's the case of, for example, the example that Nelly put in the table about the deforestation regulation, where it is and is having and will have unintended consequences associated with it that are putting partner and third countries in a more difficult position. So for us, what should be changed is that when we are speaking about new trade policies or new trade-related policies, and when we are speaking about agricultural policies, that the concept or the promise of policy coherence for development should be reinforced, because we feel that it has been a bit lost in the way. And if you don't have it present, you have situations like, again, the deforestation regulation, but also the organic regulation, where there will be important negative consequences by introducing new regulations, which, of course, we'll agree on the case of for organic regulation. We need to strengthen organic production. We need to strengthen its credibility as well. But it should be done in a way that we are taking into account what would be the impact at EU levels and outside of the EU. And that so far has not been very present in many new policies. So for us, one key aspect to reinforce that should contribute to solving a lot of different issues is policy coherence for development.
Okay, thanks. Mark, would you like to react?
Can I?
Go ahead, I'm still thinking.
Okay. Would you like me to go?
Yeah, please.
All right. Okay. So I think, I think this is a very important question. Yeah, I think it is, and it's really difficult to choose which ones to do if we were to take a single one, because I think in a way the sustainability issues are quite interwoven and they are quite linked to each other. You know, I would say the key things here is to coordinate and also to have some type of a cohesion when it comes to sustainable development, agri-food trade, etc. What do I mean by co-create? We are looking at sustainability in a light of economic sustainability, social sustainability, environmental sustainability. I mean, it will be very difficult for somebody to be thinking about social sustainability alone if they do not have the living income, as it is put in the cocoa literature, the living income, to be able to do the little things, the basic things that they need to do in their lives and then with their families. So I think that in order for example, smallholder farmers or exporters in the outside of the EU to be very focused and committed to making sure that they adhere to these sustainability requirements, we need to co-create with them. We need to actually sit around the table with them, co-create with them. What we are thinking, I mean, when I say we, and then they will also know what those outside of the EU are thinking, and co-create something that would be shared and beneficial. That way, it would have longevity, if I should leave it that way. The next thing would be to coordinate. You know, there are quite a number of things that are going on in the space right now, especially with the NGOs. I mean, so many things. If you look at just cocoa as a value chain, there's so many things going on. And sometimes I ask myself, how coordinated are these things? How are we coordinating them so that it wouldn't just be little silos of many things, but then one big pool of meaningful things that can have impact? The next will be cohesion. I mean, we need to be focused that we are going to a particular destination, and we'll try to bring everyone on board so that we get there. Definitely, there are going to be people who will dissent, but at least their dissent will give us some information as to how to shape whatever policy that we are working with and get to the destination that we want to get to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Very interesting ideas, yes. Yuki or Mark, would you like to react, or shall we give the floor to questions?
Yes, thank you. If I may say a few words.
Yeah.
Yes, this is of course a very challenging and difficult question, and I agree with earlier statement that of course the EU common agriculture policy needs a major overhaul if EU really wants to follow the principles of the Green Deal and farm to fork strategies. But I think we can still move forward in trade policy even though CAP is not changed. I mean, even this unilateral EU trade policy measures can play a role in enhancing the sustainability of industry practices, especially in global supply chains. And currently, many of the EU trade agreements include chapters on trade and sustainable development, which address both labor and environmental concerns. But of course, I agree with the earlier speakers that yes, the coherence is mostly weak, that environmental impact assessments are conducted before and during the trade negotiations, but the assessments are not really applied consistently to all trade agreements, and it remains unclear how the results are taken into account. So there is a need for more coherence there. Then, of course, an interesting thing is also what the EU is doing, that it's also pursuing these measures aimed at addressing the climate and environmental impacts of this cross-border trade, independent of this any trade agreements. For instance, this carbon border adjustment measure, I mean, that the policy that tax carbon-intensive goods at the border to prevent leakage of emissions, and okay, this tax does not yet cover at the moment any agri-food products. It affects only goods that are particularly carbon intensive, like cement, electricity, fertilizers, aluminium, and iron, and this kind of products. But anyway, it is an attempt to account for the environmental cost of trade-related carbon emissions, and although it raises, of course, also some fundamental question of fairness, in particularly in the absence of adequate funding for the technology transfer for developing countries. I mean, but it's still the one, I think, is also one potential and one possibility to go further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So I got all sorts of things to say. I'll start with one which is like, again, like on the wall. When I made this a few weeks ago, I just before this meeting, I got thinking, well, I don't actually know the history of EU development policy in the same terms. Reading something even on the train last night, and I'm not a specialist, but I got this impression that it went through a sort of period of being like, cooperative, but that now it's also becoming a little bit more, shall we say, instrumentalized. So this is all part, for me, packed in the Lisbon Treaty about the EU as an entity. So the type of language you hear is when you say, for instance, in trade, to even create somebody called a chief enforcer is like you want to tell the world, well, we're not going to have our legs pulled anymore. So it's a sort of pushback, and it comes from what we all as EU citizens have to sort of relate to is the EU is now, since 2007, an entity. Struggles in international organizations sometimes to be recognized and all the rest. But then you have, geopolitical, and colleagues mentioned it over coffee today. Well, the world has changed, and so the EU has had to change because now China does things and India do things, and this whole idea is better to be together as a whole because the world is becoming a dangerous place, etc. Well, I don't want to bring that into a discussion about sustainable ag trade, but it is. As soon as you start, and I welcome a lot. I've been 10 years now on OECD stuff, and it now astonishes me that anybody making policy in the EU, for EU citizens, does not think about the international repercussions of this. And that in terms of process, we've introduced a year or so ago an enforcement in the Commission to look at the international implications of what you're doing. Very difficult. We rely on academics to come out with all sorts of information which they don't have. They say, well, we haven't got the data, so we can't do it. Well, we haven't got the data either, so nobody can do it. But even just going through the mental process of saying this is impacting, or is this impacting Ghanaian producers, is our duty in this I would say this post-Lisbon scenario. I have to say, and I learnt it from stimulus from here. It was I was invited to the that event that used to take place in the Egmont. One speaker talked about the ontological security of EU as a cooperation project. Now, I find still in international, the safe place to go is we are a cooperation project. As soon as we start getting too pushy, countries sort of call our bluff. And in the end, I know as well, I have to scurry back to Brussels and get the member states to agree with what I'm saying. I mean, I just can't start inventing it. And I still believe that in terms of, I was listening intently, like in a world in which there's contingence and uncertainty, you say, well, actually a cooperation stance is actually better. That doesn't mean to say you might not spend a bit more on military defense, but for me, that's a more simple model than actually then getting out of cooperation, basically. But anyway, I'm a bit of a, people even still accuse me of being an idealist. But I'm basically saying that when other of your colleagues will have seen that and they're writing about that. And this is like the EU saying that we won't be pushed around. So that's one thing that I feel sort of moved to say in all this. Because it then comes down to, you see, we start to exert our interests as a Westphalian type. It's our food, it's our lithium that's important, strategic autonomy, etc. The second area, just you mentioned it as something and it's been mentioned by Ralph and I. So I do a lot of my work in the OECD. We are currently doing. Attila knows about it, that we're currently doing an inventory of trade-related environmental measures. This is still in process, but I'm going to try and find ways of getting you all a bit more involved in that. And it's been, so the material that's now coming out of the project as well is going to be starting to be useful for this. Because at the moment we just did an inventory. We basically, you asked Leonel before, we refer a lot to the so-called PPM report. So basically, when we were asked what we thought as EU were the trade-related environmental provisions, we looked to the PPM report and said, well, those are multilateral, bilateral, and autonomous measures, including deforestation. I mean, we submitted it, and it's being currently analysed, as it were. They're currently describing, and in the future we're going to start to look at the impacts. So in all those measures, you take this view as governments, but the deforestation one is very interesting because of the due diligence element. Now, I've been tracking the FAO, OECD FAO guidance on ag supply chains, due diligence guidance since it started, had very little traction amongst colleagues.
That's true.
And had very little traction in the industry.
Yeah.
So
I can confirm that. When we look at the due diligence, it is more like a formal kind of, people put it in their corporate social responsibility.
Well, so in the commission there is a corporate social responsibility breakfast, because it's not an inter-service group, and you hear, and then so the deforestation has applied, in my mind, has applied due diligence in a certain way. Okay, almost in a vacuum, because when the guidance was made and nobody wanted to talk about it. I had hardly any conversations, couldn't get any. You know that the G7 have made this report on due diligence. But so in the end, there's something about international politics. Until something's happened, you can't actually analyze anything. So if you look at the guidance, you say, well, what's going to be the impact of that? We have no data. Yeah? as soon as now countries have applied due diligence, the G7 can make a report, can ask OECD to make a report, and they start saying, oh, well, some have applied it like this and some have applied it like this. I admit we've applied it in a very specific way in the deforestation regulation, but here we are to the industry. It's sitting there as a great tool for handling this in a public-private partnership mode, not the negotiators getting you your market access, but you developing sustainable global value chains through a due diligence approach.
Can I chip in here quickly before? The only thing what we see is, I think nobody is against deforestation or the due diligence directive. But what we see, like not at all. And I think you're absolutely right. When I started to look into the topic, this like OECD FAO common guidance on responsible agricultural supply chains is very little known. So you have the big corporates, they use it. It's in there, so to say. But then if we trickle it down to the SMEs, and that is the big problem in here. The agri-food supply chains are so complex, fragmented. Partially, you have 1,000 farmers delivering soy to one mini regional trader who's then delivering it to the port, and then there's another, then it will be redistributed. So it's very difficult to track changes. And the question is now, how do we implement it in a practical way? In a feasible way. I think this is the big question, not the due diligence itself, because I think it's absolutely understandable just how, and deforestation with this very like specific kind of IT reporting system, which is very unilateral and bit disregarding also the third country partners' efforts and systems and so on, that is causing the problem. It's not that people would want to source products from deforested areas. It's more about the implementation component here. But it's also our job to be more practical about it. So
so the reason I mentioned that I mentioned that because so we're doing it in the OECD. You sort of then say, okay, what are governments doing? You can make a nice inventory of things and you can start analyzing and echo Ralph's argument. What are they doing in the FTAs? Is it effective? You can catalog it. It's all government. But then you say, well, what about the private sector? And then, alternative in the OECD, and I only found this out a few weeks ago, they've made a typology of sustainability initiatives in trade. It's in all trade, not just ag trade. We were trying to do one in agriculture, and this one completely eclipsed it. The notion behind the OECD is that you would have this sophisticated typology, and if you had a company, you would go and try to shop for what sustainability initiative would suit you. So it's like, oh, I'd like to do a bit of this, and that suits me. And then you would choose, because they would all have a monitoring process, a certification. They would. It's a sort of a marketplace type. That's their sort of interpretation of it. I've heard when Ralph said quite rightly, and I hear it all the time around the table in the OECD. Oh, there's myriad initiatives. It's all fragmented. Well, the world's always been fragmented. I just a point of view. The question is, what does it add up to? It can add up to if you take, and the work of the OECD in the trade part, this part is driven by cooperation between the trade and the responsible business conduct. As you come back all the time. And here we are. For me, yes, the corporates get it. It's sort of in the corporate. Well, you don't have to have all the SMEs in it. An SME or a farmer with his or her partner can do their due diligence in half an hour over the kitchen table. But no. They've got 2 cows, and it's not actually particular. The risk assessment is not, the reputation risk is not high. Okay, Of course, and this is all part of in the EU about professionalization of the sector. Yes, once you have 50 cows, you've got liabilities to the nitrates directive, you've got this, you've got that. You can't any longer think that it's just something you do. They know this, yeah? So they can start coming into it. It's not. For me, a lot of this is, oh no, it will. It'll never work. It's too complicated. Well, it's tashdwil. It spreads.
Just want to say, I'm not representing the farmers. I'm representing the traders.
But it spreads. It spreads. But it spreads in the mentality, and it's not. And it's not spreading. Should we say fast enough? But for me, this is the whole question about what policies are better for the private sector to get on with the job.
Yeah. I actually agree with Mark that I think the EU regulation already has an impact, especially this due diligence, that companies are really checking already their value chain and discussing purchasing practices, wage, income, and influence on the value chain. So it has an impact, and that's an important way to go forward. And maybe in this way, by setting this kind of standards, that the EU in a way will lead by an example and also in the long term influence the global practices.
But I find analytically it's extremely challenging for you said it yourself, the traditional trade analyst comes to the due diligence and then doesn't know where to start, and then you say, well, we've got to work with the sector, which is why that one of the few successes of the farm to fork was the code of conduct. I remember colleagues poo-pooing this was not right, it's got no teeth, etc. No, I said it's due diligence.
Yeah, sure.
The due diligence approach. That's what is fundamental. I've tried to then say to people when they've said, well, what are you talking about? Yeah, it's there. It's at the bottom of the code of conduct. And that will, if there is going to be virtuous collective behavior, and I have no reason to believe why Europeans would not be collectively virtuous. We've been in the past. We also do this whole cooperation project so that we stop being vicious to each other. So you say, yeah, there's an opportunity here for responsible companies who actually do face real reputational risks every time you go out on the stage.
But okay, let me be very clear. I was not critical about it. I just wanted to say, I just wanted to flag that there are practical problems in the supply chain in implementing it. And I think this aligns a bit with what Virginia is saying. If we look at the complexity, then really to know this rice farmer in Myanmar, is he really not applying child labor, is a difficult process. And yeah, you're right, it takes some time. And that's what I meant with the implementation part. I think companies have understood, and I see it throughout the entire sectors, that if they don't change, we are jeopardizing our future. I think we are at this point that also corporates have understood that. What I wanted to say though, when we look at trade policy tools as well, is something on what is very interesting when we look on this debate on, there's an ambiguity on standards, and it changed a bit. It was in the past SPS, but now it's environmental standards. So we look at EU internal component, and we see farmers going on the street saying oh, we have so high standards. We basically were not competitive enough. Then we go to third countries who say that we have one set of third countries who says, your standards are so incredibly high, we can basically not achieve them. And then there's a third set of countries who says, actually, we also have really high standards. We also could apply them, And I think what would be that is something would be very important to me, because we're really at the forefront in trying to find a consensus between the three angles, because I believe if we continue not addressing it, it will just heat up the debate, but we need to have a practical solution. And I think we need further demystification. So the first question is, who's the guardian of the standards, who's right or who's wrong? And a lot of these debates are happening in an empty, uninformed space. So we're saying, oh yeah, this country has bad animal welfare standards. But actually, it might not be true. It might be just a different context. And I think we need more and more dedicated impact assessment at the beginning to really create that transparency, because that will also help farmers here to understand, oh, they're actually not having that divergent, but we're starting to create this understanding. And this is also something we could include into the TSD chapters, and to use the DAGs, the domestic advisory groups, much more to really do this assessment and to create that transparency and to demystify the debate. Because if we really know, we can address it, you know, we can say, okay, if Argentina is really having such a low animal welfare standards, we have to do something. But so far it's in an empty kind of.
So it's one thing until you asked, like, what would you like to see change or something? I nearly gave the sort of like nerdy analyst answer, but the slow nerdy analyst answer, which would be to say, yeah, first you have to know what's going on. We were I saw it flash in my tray yesterday. So the stuff you're doing on regulatory distance. And the latest comments are made to the OECD, so also giving back to them what they'd given out maybe 5 or 6 years ago on international regulatory cooperation. They made, so I can provide this to you if you're interested. Because for me, so it's what the OECD call that, yeah. So in the trade context, it says, so okay, you know, you're country X, I'm country Y. You know, you're a negotiator. Well, that's fine. You and I know how to negotiate. But in fact, your colleague there is the environment person. So you need to get a conversation between that environment person and that environment person, if you really care about the environment. If you don't, we'll just keep negotiating. Yeah? Just keep playing game, whatever, however you want to analyze trade, you know, whether it's game theory or whatever. But in actual fact, those two colleagues are working on environment, and usually you find behind the border, they actually have quite a sincere dedication to their work. They care within the context of whatever Brazilian government. They care, they're doing their best. And so they have things to share. But then indeed, how do you share this information? On what scale do you put it? What I like about your colors, and I've often felt this with analysis, and we need to move on to this now because it's going to be a new area, then you put the figures on there, you put the colors on it, and now if that provokes a reaction, I'm not that different from Australia. Well, okay, tell me in what way you know that you're closer, and we'll change from dark red to blue. We'll start, if you say, no, we have an understanding, and that could happen in the infrastructure we have of the FTAs. But the basic click, and this for me is, here we are. Have you noticed? I think you said, I mean, here. Yeah, keep going, yes. So it started to astonish me more and more that in DG Agri, we're not particularly interested in the agriculture of Australia, except for the part that they trade. Then we're really interested. But whether it's going well or badly or poisoning rivers or, I mean, read an FAO report. I mean, I'm not saying, because then you see what happens is people in DG Agri are very busy. The trade negotiations with all the things that you can argue about in the trade negotiation, a whole long list, the meetings get filled up with SPS, irritants, blah, blah, blah. No time to actually say, well, what's going on in the country. And then should we say no political? So until you actually, and I don't think the treaty is going to change in the near future for the agriculture part to say, you know, think global. You have a duty to think it will continue to be standard of living and productivity. And the only channels in the CAP objectives are through the trade runs, let's say, and this interesting hook of reasonable prices for consumers. Then you have to basically take an interest in the environment of the other country. And in the way, I know you've been poking questions about coordination between departments. Well, okay, I've said, well, it's not agri. We don't know the environment. It's the environment department. You talk. Yeah? And so then there's this question about coordination, because then we all know that in most countries, 70% of the environment is agricultural, let's say. Usually a big land user, unless you're dealing with a desertic country, but that can be accommodated. So it's basically starting to ask those questions, but in a cooperative manner, with a wanting to understand. I see. So you do it that way. But you get to the same angle, and this is where you're quite right, and I don't understand. In your family, I've had more questions asked about standards in the last 3 months, 6 months now. And you say, well, it doesn't work that way. We don't tell Australia or Ghana how they have to make their laws. No, and here we are. If only we had more international standards we could follow. And then with the standards debate, you get into, well, I don't want my standards. I don't want, it becomes highly complicated. Well, you've first of all got to take an interest in the environment of the country, where it's got to go, and then not throw stones on glass houses. If you've got a problem with your nitrates, well, maybe I could help you. Speak to the Dutch. Yeah, maybe we can work together. We have solutions.
Okay. Any questions from the room or online to any of the panelists? Now it's time for you to ask questions if you want to.
Yes, I had a question. I think maybe you made the statement around that we were struggling coming up with definition of sustainability for agriculture. So